first ride on the 2018 Trance Advanced 1. First thing that I notice is how precise and crisp the shifting is. So when you're shifting into a smaller cog, harder gear in the back, it's a little bit quicker than a Shimano XT that I've been using. And it's the lever feel is just a little bit more positive feeling. That click is just a little bit more prominent, both upshifting and downshifting. You know, just riding along when I just started, it feels very similar to the 2018 Trance 2, the aluminum model, just because the suspension or the geometry is the same, the cockpit's the same. I've been riding my cross-country bike for a while, and the steering on a trail bike is so much different than a cross-country bike. The turning is more sluggish at the slower speeds, but when you get up to speed, you feel like you can throw this bike around a lot without losing control. I'm on the first climb of the day, and I've got the shock in the middle, and climbing is so important on a trail bike because you do so much of it. When you're out on a mountainous ride, you're probably climbing 70% of the time so you can get to your downhills. And so far, really good on this bike. It feels like the shock is really supple on this bike, but it's firm enough for in the saddle climbing. So if I were to get out of the saddle, the suspension really moves. So in the saddle, I leave it in the middle setting, and unless I were on like a fire road or a paved road, then I would definitely put it in the firmest setting in the rear. But I like the way it feels in the middle setting. A lot of the climbs that I do in North Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina are really chunky, and so you like to have some movement in the rear suspension. So I said in my opening video of the first look of this bike, I was a little apprehensive about the brakes. So far, so I did do I seated in the brakes by doing, I don't know, half a dozen really hard stops on the brakes to seat in the brake pads. Probably they need to be seated in a little bit more, probably just from riding. They don't feel like they have that initial bite that my XT brakes have. So I've got XT on my cross-country bike, but I can't really judge it yet because sometimes you really got to seat them in before you get the full power. So I found that you need a couple rides. So I'm not going to comment too much about the brakes yet until I get several rides on these, but they have good modulation, really good modulation actually. Like I said in the first video, I like the levers. They have a good feel to them, and you can adjust them tools free like you can with XT. So far this bike feels incredibly responsive. You know, the carbon wheels, carbon frame allow the bike to remain really stiff in the corners, so you can spring back and forth between the corners. I'm going to drop the seat post on this short little descent here. We'll get our first taste of using the lever in action. It is so smooth. Oh man, there's some stuff down all over the place. All right. Oh, another tree down. Good grief. We have a lot of big storm come through here. The back tire feels like it's just glued to the ground on this bike. I mean, this suspension with this piggyback reservoir shock so far, I love it. it feels like the back tire has tons of braking grip on the descents, which is so important when the trails get chunky. This dropper seat post is absolutely buttery smooth on this bike. Giant's finally nailed it with their dropper post. Yeah, that was kind of a sharp turn there, and the brakes feel good. Like I said, I think the strongest point so far about the brakes is the modulation. Excellent modulation in these brakes. I can't remember exactly how the older Avid brakes felt, but I don't think modulation was quite as good as these. Short, steep climb here. The lever on this shock is easier to reach. The piggyback reservoir, I showed it in the first look video. It's a totally different position than what I've used in the past, and it's actually a lot easier to reach. Going from 29er wheels to 27.5, even on a longer travel trail bike, feels like these wheels kind of just dive in the corners easier, which takes a little bit of getting used to because you can overshoot a corner if you're not careful, even with slacker geometry. You know, on trails like this that are non-mountainous, where you have to use your own pedaling to generate speed, I still actually prefer my cross-country bike, even over a fast, lightweight trail bike like this. I just like speed, and I can go faster on these trails where, again, you're having to do it with your own pedaling and not use gravity as much. But that's not why I have this bike. This is my mountain trip bike, and that's where I love riding these trances. So even though I don't need this low of a gear, I dropped this thing all the way down to that 50 tooth cog. So that massive cog, super low gear, kind of see how it felt. It feels good. I can get away with a higher gear on this climb. Yeah, that's the 50 tooth cog. I don't know if you would ever need a gear any lower than that. I felt like that with the 46 on my Shimano, so I highly doubt I would ever need a gear lower than 50 in the back. For 2018, after spending time on the aluminum Trance 2 and now this one, I'm going to say that Giant have made their trances less cross-country focused and more gravity focused. These bikes are still fine on these type of cross-country trails, but they don't feel quite as snappy. Two reasons: the shocks are tuned a little bit softer, and the cockpit is more gravity focused, so shorter stem, wider bars. So on the cross-country trail, you're sitting back a little bit more. You're not as aggressive and as aggressive as a stance for cross-country riding. So, but man, when the trail goes downhill, there's no other bike I'd rather be on than a long travel trail bike. You know, I talked about the lower center of gravity on this bike when I did my first look, and it works. So those corners where you're just kind of laying the bike over pretty hard, lower center of gravity is awesome. I haven't had any pedal strikes yet. Not that I'm riding real rocky terrain yet, but so far this bike feels flawless. No rattling on the bike, nothing that stands out as something that really needs attention. And this is a bike where line choice isn't as crucial. These longer travel bikes, you can just plow over stuff. I don't have to worry about trying to pick a perfect line. Terrain out here is a little loose because of all the rain. And this bike, when you start to slide a little bit, especially the rear end, you still maintain a lot of control. That's one thing great about slacker geometry bikes. They're so much more forgiving when the bike starts to slide. And part of that is the longer or the shorter chainstay. I've noticed that on bikes with longer chainstays, they're hard to control when you start to slide. Fortunately, bikes today are coming with shorter chainstays. Let's go ahead and wrap up the video. It's probably getting pretty long anyway. So, to sum up this bike, this thing's a beast on the descents. Can't wait to take this thing on a long, rough mountain descent. Climbs very well. Not as sprightly and fast as my cross-country bike, but that's to be expected. It's very, very snappy on the corners. The carbon wheels and frame really make that happen. Accelerates very well. Just a super fun bike to ride. Like I mentioned earlier, there's really nothing that stands out as a negative on my first ride. The brakes, I'm used to them. It's, you know, I think they'll seat in a little bit more, have a little bit more bite initially. So that's my report of the first ride aboard the 2018 Giant Trance Advanced 1. More videos to come on this bike and the components, so stay tuned to the channel for those. Thanks for watching.